in love with nonprofit.
I do
So
it every time.
what made me fall in love with nonprofits was I had a kind of an important experience, life experience when I was serving in the Peace Corps in Jamaica. And during those 2 years, I witnessed extreme poverty, families living in shacks built by hand, overcrowded schools, fragile communities, communities wiped out by hurricanes. People were really struggling. And I thought of that Fred Rogers quote. I think he said during September 11th, something like, "In times of crisis, look for the helpers." And I had the great opportunity, it was my privilege to work alongside those types of nonprofit heroes. And I saw every day how they were changing lives. And that experience just moved me. So when I finished my 2-year tour of duty in the Peace Corps and came back to the US, I couldn't get those heroic people out of my mind. And I knew I wanted to find some way to serve people who were solving social problems. And then another thing that shaped my motivation was that prior to the Peace Corps, I was working in the business world. So I was working in quality systems, and I really admired these great business thinkers. Many of you probably, are familiar with, like Drucker and Covey and Deming. And so I thought, if there's some way that I could take that knowledge from the business world, but help these wonderful, heroic nonprofit folks, that's what I wanted to do. And I also realized that having a foot in both worlds is kind of a strength, and a differentiator. And I realized that maybe I could help translate some of these great management practices in a way that makes sense for nonprofits. So I'm going to share my deck. Let's see here. It is, if I share my screen. Does that? No, that is not what we want to see. Let me stop here. I think my PowerPoint disappeared just for a second. So sorry. Let me get this figured out here. 1 second. There it is. Okay. Let me try this again. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you all can see a PowerPoint now.
Coming up. Yeah, we got it.
Okay, sorry about that. And let's start the PowerPoint. Okay.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, that's really what I've been doing for these last 20 years is helping nonprofit teams be more effective and innovative. And I set out to write a book about this. And don't get too far away from the chat because I do want to ask the audience a question in just a little bit. But first question is, why should we care about nonprofits? So my answer to that is, if you think about it, nonprofits provide some of the greatest gifts to the world and take on some of its hardest problems. We're building civil society. Our work eases hunger, fights injustice. Nonprofits that advance education help break the chains of ignorance and poverty and make upward mobility more likely. And this can be true of for-profit companies and B corporations as well. So that's why I'm talking about the social impact sector. But most of my work has been with nonprofits. So you'll hear me talk mostly about nonprofits. But I just want to say that, there are businesses out there doing a lot of good too. So many people are counting on this work that we're doing. But as we know, generosity and good intentions aren't enough by themselves. So think about what it means if we provide mediocre programming to an at-risk young person. I've seen it. The stakes are really high. So as I started to write, the question in my mind was, well, what makes a nonprofit innovative and effective? And if we could look under the hood of wildly successful nonprofits, but also failed nonprofits, what could we learn? And why is it that some punch above their weight and others misfire? And, donors care very much about these questions too. They want their generous, donations to be put to good use. And we need to be good stewards, right? We need organizations that empower us to ask courageous questions and innovate and experiment to discover what works best. So I'm going to talk maybe around 30, maybe 35 minutes tops, and we'll definitely leave time for Q&A. So I want to jump into, this is probably a kind of an obvious question, but what do we even mean by nonprofit innovation? I think most people, when they hear innovation, their minds automatically go to the for-profit business world. And, you think of cool inventions that we all love, like the iPad or, if you go to the dentist's office now, there's a 3D printer that's printing out the crown for your tooth right there on the spot, right? All these amazing, technologies and innovations. But, we have innovation all the time in the nonprofit sector. And sadly, I think a lot of nonprofit leaders just don't think of themselves that way, but they are. So what is innovation? Well, I think of it just simply as finding new and better ways of doing things. And it can be big or small. So in the nonprofit sector, some examples of really big innovation might be the creation of the 911 emergency phone system. There was a time, I think it was in the 70s or so, when that didn't exist. And it took nonprofits, philanthropy, first responders all coming together and coming up with this big innovation that changed how we operate and how emergencies are handled across the entire country. Or think of the big things that the X Prize Foundation works on, like the global water crisis, or the American Civil Rights Movement. Very big. They were highly strategic and innovative in how they were solving, very serious problems. But then, nonprofit innovation might also mean inventing something. I think of an example where a Stanford University professor asked students to find solutions for the problems of premature deaths for babies in India. And they noticed that incubators weren't being used in hospitals. And what the students discovered through a lot of research and asking questions was that the rural families couldn't reach the hospitals. So instead, the students actually came up with a new design for incubators that were portable and much cheaper. And they kind of looked like infant-sized heated sleeping bags. And their invention has saved lives. So that's an invention that came out of the nonprofit world. But innovation can also be really small and humble. And an example I think of is, think of a legal aid clinic where you have a lot of people walking in to get free legal advice. And they have to take a lot of information about folks coming in. And usually, if you're in the reception area, maybe there's a clipboard and 5 or 6 pages of forms you're answering. And maybe the person at the reception desk said, hey, what if we just used iPads instead to take this information? And now it's going directly into our system. We don't have to pay someone for data entry. And while that seems like a really small improvement, you think of now that that's freed up time and resources that can be put to better use elsewhere, right? So this is all good, right? We want all these things, innovation, big or small. So how do we encourage that in our workplaces and build it into our everyday practices? This might be easier said than done. So I think this is where I'd love for you to stay near the chat because I want to ask the audience this question. So you've probably come up with great ideas, in your own work experiences that maybe you've, proposed to your team or to your boss. Maybe you've come up with, or noticed a better way of doing things. So I'd like to ask if you could enter this in the chat, what gets in the way in reality? And be honest, as that'll be helpful to our conversation. So I'd just love to hear from you. What's in your experience? What kind of gets in the way of finding new and better ways of doing things in the workplace? And I may not be able to see the chat since I'm sharing the screen. So I don't know if Jordana sees responses that she could call out. That would be great.
I sure will. So if folks want to drop something in the chat, the first one I see is siloed operators and fraction decision making.
A good one.
How to actually get the idea accomplished.
Execution.
Mm-hmm. What else do we have? The lack of knowledge of who to go to get things done, such as developers for apps.
Okay. Yeah. So confusion about who kind of owns the decision. Yeah, it's a good one.
And I think I'm also hearing in that one, not maybe having the resources or network if you're looking for external expertise.
Excellent. These are really thoughtful responses. Keep them coming. This is great.
And I know it is tricky in webinar form. If you're on your phone to get into the chat.
Okay.
Burning.
No, these were really good. I'll go ahead and move on then. So I ask this question a lot when I'm giving workshops, especially to nonprofit staff. And so these are types of things I'll hear from folks. And yeah, you all came up with some different angles here, which was great. But I think some of this might have been embedded in some of the responses, but bureaucracy, right? Maybe fear of overstepping. Some of these are probably true of any type of sector that you're working in, whether it's business, government, or nonprofit. But some of these are unique to the nonprofit world. I would say, especially this fog of good intentions. In the nonprofit sector, I love working in this sector. Like, usually you really believe in the mission, like you're doing something good, maybe a powerful mission, you're serving folks and very passionate about the mission and helping people. But it can be foggy, just because you have good intentions doesn't mean you know how to fix it. So that can be a challenge for us. Bureaucracy is a big one in nonprofits, and we'll get to metrics and evaluation and how if it's done poorly, it can turn into a bureaucracy. We can have blind spots right there. So I just think it's important to be really honest about the messy realities of the nonprofit workplace or any workplace. And now that we've identified some of those obstacles to innovation, then we can ask, okay, we've identified them. Now what can we do about it? And that's a lot of what I was doing in my book. So I'm a believer in stealing good ideas wherever you see them. And so Pixar is pretty well known for being a great company. Their movies have won 23 Academy Awards and are some of the highest grossing animated films of all time, like Toy Story. So I was curious, what's the secret to their success? So one of the things I learned about Pixar is that teams are expected to give what they call brutal feedback to each other. And a Pixar executive says that they assume early on that all of our movies suck. And the job of the creative feedback process is to get from the movie from suck to unsuck. And I think that's kind of shocking language. But that same executive explained that importantly, everyone in the room knows that the questions raised must be in the spirit of making the creative product as good as it possibly can be. And so without the manager setting the tone as a safe space, that kind of tough love feedback process would probably never get off the ground. So how do they do this? They use a creative process called design thinking. Some of you might be familiar with design thinking. It's been around for decades. It's often used by a lot of marketing and design firms and creative companies like Pixar. But I think there are some parallels to designing a movie and designing nonprofit programs and interventions, and that we can definitely translate design thinking techniques for our own use and nonprofits. So I'm going to show you how I thought about this. So this is kind of the Leah version, the Leah's nonprofit version of design thinking. I kind of, tried it out with teams and kind of shaped it in a way that made sense for us. But design thinking is a process for exploring what's possible and thinking creatively and strategically. And so my version, first we ask ourselves three questions, and I'll explain each of these a little bit. What's desirable? What's scalable and what's feasible. So that's the thinking part. And then once we've done that thinking, then there's an action part. Based on that thinking, how might we design pilots or experiments to test our thinking? Um, and so, with the question of what's desirable, that's a way of asking what's really the problem we're trying to solve. Are we good at identifying hidden needs for the people we're serving or, whoever our nonprofit mission is serving? And it can be a struggle. It can be really foggy. I love this quote from Henry Ford, where he said something like, "If I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." So sometimes we have to work really hard to figure out what is the need that I'm trying to solve for, the problem I'm trying to solve. And so if we get clear about that social problem we intend to solve, then everything we do will cascade from that. So for example, let's say that you're a nonprofit that focuses on workforce development. Well, what aspect of workforce development is your nonprofit going to work on? Like, for example, if I became unemployed, would you be targeting someone like me? Maybe with just a little bit of help, I could readily get back into the workforce. Are you targeting the chronically unemployed, maybe the homeless, right? Or people who are getting work for the first time? Completely different problems, right? You're going to design your nonprofit completely differently depending on how you answer that question. So let's look at an example of that. So Greyston Bakery is a nonprofit bakery in Yonkers, New York, and they're a workforce development nonprofit. And so the team at the bakery decided they wanted to take on some of those hardest cases of the chronically unemployed. And they worked really hard to understand the problem they wanted to solve. So first, their founder, who's super smart aeronautical engineer, was so passionate about this cause that he actually experimented with living on the street for a few weeks. He wanted to better understand the clients they served and wanted to walk in their shoes a little bit. And what he learned from those immersion experiences was really powerful. So based on this experience, they set to work incorporating lessons from those direct observations to inform every detail of Greyston's very unusual business model. For example, they created an apprenticeship program that's open to absolutely anyone. The bakery has a first come, first serve waiting list 4 out of 5 workers might be gone within a week or two, but they can always sign up again. The unique thing about their model is that everyone gets a chance and some succeed. And they're really a success in their field, providing dignity of work to those highest risk hires who were previously thought unemployable. So by asking themselves hard questions, this helped them find clarity about their why and their how. And it's just so important to be clear about that right from the start, because then all the things that you design in your nonprofit will cascade from that. So because of time, I won't go into, as many stories for each one of these. I'll just quickly explain. But, this question of what's scalable helps nonprofit teams think about how to scale and how to build ecosystems for change. Because social change is complex and often requires many groups coming together, like the American Civil Rights Movement or the problem of overfishing. That's complex. You're going to need a lot of stakeholders to come together for something like that. The question of what's feasible is, we have limited resources. We can't say yes to everything. Um, so even though there are so many problems we want to tackle in nonprofits, we have to narrow and focus, and we have to avoid groundless optimism. We have to be realistic. So in those, thought exercises of what's desirable and what's scalable, that's where you can kind of just be like, sky's the limit. Let's put crazy ideas out there. Let's be wild, and, put anything on the table. Let's be creative, which is good. But the what's feasible is where, okay, now we do need to bring some, realism into our brainstorming. And I think that's important. And then experimentation, our dazzling idea may or may not work. We have to find out. And so we can design small experiments, learn and adjust before we scale and grow our idea. But then what does experimentation look like for nonprofits? Sometimes I'll ask that, and people just, nonprofit audiences will just look at me blankly because, you hear that word experimentation and maybe you think of a science lab, but we actually do experimentation in nonprofits as well. And so one of my favorite examples of this is World Reader. So World Reader is a nonprofit with a mission to bring digital books to disadvantaged children and their families. And when they launched in 2010, they began several experiments at the same time. So in one experiment, like that picture down on the bottom left, they gave Amazon Kindle e-reader machines or tablets to elementary students in Ghana. And they were really jazzed about this. They thought this is going to be a success. But what they found in reality was that when the children would play during recess, the devices kept breaking. So that was a surprise. But at the same time, their team was also experimenting with a mobile app, which they learned from observation that the young users actually much preferred. So today, almost 200,000 users a month are reading books on the mobile platform, which is fantastic. But I think there are several good lessons in this story. So World Reader really, they spread their bets. If they would have gone all in on those Kindle e-reader machines that they were pretty excited about, they may have never discovered the better solution with the mobile app. So I think a lesson here is it can be far better to fail fast and fail small before investing too big. And experimentation can help us learn and innovate. But to do that, we have to build in some expectation and toleration of failure. And that can be a challenge in the nonprofit sector. So it's really important for leaders, boards, executive directors of nonprofits to have that right attitude towards risk and failure. And there's a story I love from the Hewlett Foundation. So the Hewlett Foundation offers a prize to grants officers and encourages them to share what they called the worst grant from which you learned the most. And I think they offer silly door prizes and they kind of gather together. And I just love that, because they, can laugh at themselves a little bit, be human. And, if we want to innovate or discover, like you can only really do that through trial and error, which requires, mistakes and failures. It just comes with the territory. But, you have to feel like you have permission from the top of your organization to do that. So then, that's kind of the first section of the book, just using design thinking to get to clarity of thinking and then run experiments to test our thinking. So then the natural next question then is, well, how do we learn and adjust? And in the nonprofit world, this is where measurement and evaluation come in. But it can be really hairy. I was giving a talk on metrics at a nonprofit conference a few months ago, and during the Q&A, someone I knew in the audience, he raised his hand and he said, with all due respect, Leah, nonprofit measurement kills my soul. And I agree, like if it's done poorly, it can just cause all sorts of stress. And I loved his honesty. Why do we hear this so often, and what needs to change to make it better in our sector? So there's so many ways we can do this wrong. And so I think it helps just to let's be open and honest. Let's name those things and make sure we don't do them. So there's a really good book I recommend to everyone who is interested in this topic, but it's called The Tyranny of Metrics. You can read it. It's about 3 to 4 hour read, and the author's really creative. So he uses HBO's The Wire, the series The Wire, and stories from the policing and school system in that show to then illustrate bad measurement practices, things we don't want to do. It's fun to read. Like he does a great job. So I recommend that book to everyone, but he only kind of talks about the pitfalls of measurement, but then never gets into, well, what should measurement do for us? So that's where I kind of pick up in my book. So like an example from HBO's The Wire, he shares the story of when the mayor's office pressures the police to reduce major crimes by 5%, which then, of course, creates incentives for the police to overlook actual crimes. So yeah, we can definitely measure the wrong thing, so many ways we can do it wrong. Um, and we can be patting ourselves on the back. We might be tracking things that are easy to track, like our media hits or website visits, and we could be mistakenly patting ourselves on the back and still be doing, the big picture things wrong. So I'm getting close to the end of my presentation. I just want to quickly share 2 examples of that about measurements. So let me just get a drink really quick. So this is a great story, one laptop per child. So the lesson with them, while we should pursue a bold vision, at the same time, our goals should be realistic and achievable. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. A lot of journalists have written about the failure of this international development initiative from 2005, known as One Laptop Per Child. So the idea here was they wanted to build a low-cost, sturdy laptop for school children in developing countries around the world. And by all appearances, there was a lot of excitement. The concept seemed pretty good. There was, they had press conferences, there was a lot of buzz, but it ended up being more hype than impact. So probably as a lot of, folks listening in know, with running a business and having effective business models, there were just all sorts of problems that started to happen. Problems started becoming apparent. There were manufacturing issues, supply chain problems, software bugs, breakages, soaring costs, delivery issues, failure to adapt the features for local cultures. Children weren't actually using the computers for their intended use. So, the project was launched with the best of intentions and a true desire to make the world a better place. But as we know, energy and hype just aren't enough, right? We have to make sure that our good intentions aren't derailed by utopian thinking that isn't grounded in reality. And so from reading case studies about this effort, I never really got a sense of rigorous evaluation or measurement, any sort of measurement program for the project that could have provided evidence or helped the group ask harder questions to help them learn and adjust. So in another example, LifeWorks is a nonprofit that focuses on at-risk youth and foster care in Austin, Texas. And they were doing okay, like by all, metrics that they had and, their results reporting to their donors and their stakeholders, like they were having good results with the young people they were helping. But they felt something was missing and that they could do better. So they brought their team members together for a series of brainstorms, and they started asking, what's really the ultimate problem we're trying to solve? And through discussion, they were dealing with that sort of fog of good intentions. And so through their discussion, what they came to realize was that they wanted all of their work to be laser focused to help each of their clients become self-sufficient in their life. And so then they started asking hard questions about each of their 17 programs. Do each of those programs put us on a path to achieve that goal of young people achieving self-sufficiency? And they realized actually not so much. Many of their programs were outdated or serving other purposes or just reflected thinking from many years before. For example, as they looked at their workforce training programs, they realized their programming, like classroom-based trainings or interview practices and on-the-job skills training, was designed for professional adults rather than for young people wrestling with trauma. And the workforce training program was actually failing because it was misaligned with their clients' needs. And then they started looking at models of workforce development trainings in the mental health field for a better fit. And they created new programming that was trauma informed. And within a year, job retention was measurably increasing. And they started applying that same scrutiny to all 17 of their programs to make sure they really were helping a young person become more self sufficient. So they were asking themselves hard questions. And what they were really asking with their metrics and evaluation was, how do we know if what we're doing is working? And their programs continuing to show stronger results for their clients, and they're growing. So to me, that provides evidence for, well-designed metrics can help us ask powerful questions and serve as a meaningful feedback loop. So getting close to the end, I just wanted to summarize a little bit because I know we went very quickly through the book. But there are, if I could summarize the whole book into six kind of punchy, practices, this is really, I think, a good summary of the book. So, like a detective, be a fearless problem solver and uncover hidden needs. So, in that first section of the book with design thinking, where we talked about what's desirable, there's a whole chapter on that and stories and examples of how nonprofits, kind of act as that detective and try to uncover like what is the real need, like the immersion experience at Greyston Bakery. Number two, ask courageous questions, really ideate. And we could start small, but dream big. And one thing I noticed with really big nonprofits we've all heard of, like Mayo Clinic, Habitat for Humanity, Alcoholics Anonymous, they might be big and famous now, but they all started very small and humble. Just a few maybe founders or volunteers who started with just a shell of a little nut of an idea and no resources. And I think that can be really encouraging to all of us, with new ideas, that we don't have to start with being grandiose, right? We all start small usually. Number three, when people on the front lines are empowered to speak up and collaborate, breakthroughs will happen. We want to leave room for experiments, play, risk-taking, and even failure, like the world reader example. It can be really good to embrace continuous learning by asking ourselves hard questions. And we have to persuade. We have to be really good at this. So, I mean, most people would say, well, duh, yeah, fundraising. And that's true. We have to be very persuasive, usually, with nonprofits to convince people, to donate. But there's so many other ways. Like, for example, you want to persuade superstar talent to come work at your nonprofit. Or if you're larger nonprofits, like I worked at a larger nonprofit, you might have to persuade the team down the hall to support your idea, that it's a good idea. Right. So I think these six things kind of all work together to help support innovation. And so, yeah, I want to thank you for your time. I think we're going to shift over to Q&A, and I'll stop sharing my screen in just a minute, but I'll leave this up just for a few seconds. This is how to reach me. And thank you so much for your time. And I'm just really eager to dive into your questions. And yeah, LinkedIn is especially like a really great living community. So if you're interested in, nonprofits, nonprofit innovation, just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And, we're posing all sorts of fun discussion questions all the time. So I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
What a wonderful way to kick us off. I really appreciate you sharing your insights and so succinctly, and bringing in stories is always very helpful. So appreciate that. So for folks who may have joined a couple minutes late, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar. So you're welcome to drop a question in there. I'm also checking the chat. But I think we'd also very much welcome you to come off of mute. So if you want to also ask your question verbally, we can do that as well. I'd like to get us started with something that comes up a lot when we're working with nonprofits who might have existing funding. I know there's an emerging trend with funders and being more open to experimentation with the grants that they give, but some grants are also quite constrained by the projected outcomes and activities that have been included in that proposal. And so just wonder if you could maybe talk to us a little bit about, how do you think through working with funders, and that tension between expected outcomes with your existing grant agreements and trying to bring in that experimentation, or are there opportunities for a little bit of wolf in sheep's clothing, or what can the audience do?
Yeah, so there's how I think about it, and yeah, see how this strikes folks, and feel free to add further comments if what I say sparks other ideas or even disagreement. So I think one story that might be helpful, and this will be relevant. I will get to your question, but I'll share a story to get there. So as I was interviewing folks for my book, I one of the people I interviewed was my own executive director at my nonprofit. And he shared a story. I thought this was such a great example, where he had one of our program managers, who was a scholar, wanted to launch a podcast. And my executive director, Dan, had seen the nonprofit last 4 times the nonprofit tried podcast there. They had kind of flopped. And so, here's this like program manager all excited, like, I want to launch this new podcast. Here's the idea. Here's the audience. He was really excited about it. And my executive director was sitting there kind of like skeptical, thinking to himself, oh my gosh, not another flop. And so to his credit, because he believed in kind of a culture of experimentation, he talked with the scholar about this. Well, what if we pitched your podcast as an experiment? Here's kind of what I'm worried about. I've seen others fail. So rather than just launching this as a forever project, let's treat it as an experiment. Let's set the number of podcast episodes you'll do. Maybe you'll try it for the next 4 months, 6 months, whatever the time frame is. And, what are the parameters you want to watch for? Like, how many listeners do you hope to see in that time period? So together they kind of work through it. And I thought that was so great, because he could have acted as a micromanager, squashed the idea. He had good evidence of seeing it not work so well in the past, but I thought he had a really good openness to experimentation. And so I think it's kind of the same, right, with major funders, right? It might be the same sort of setup. So in a way, I feel like if they're not already believers in this kind of risk taking or experimentation, then maybe we can make the case. And I'm trying to do that in my book. I have a whole chapter on experimentation. I gave the world reader example, but the chapter's full of them. So what if, maybe it's that we need to make a better case to funders to convince them, like, look, here are 6 examples of experimentation. So even if we are risk averse, right, we can treat these as small experiments and look at the payoff, right? As we share kind of like these 5 or 6 examples of nonprofits that did it, even though there were short-term failures, you would see the long-term payoff, because through the experimentation they found, and even through failure, they would end up finding something that worked even better. And to me, it's that trial and error just comes with the territory, right? So we have to leave room for, it's just going to pay off in the long run. So that's kind of my answer there. Like, I think maybe there's a need or a gap where we have to make a better case to funders, and work that into our pitches or our proposals. Like, I'm a nonprofit and here's what I want to do. And we're posing it as an experiment. And these are just like that podcast, right? These are the parameters. These are the metrics. These are the risks. We're going to be open with you. We're worried about this. And I think that really shows credibility, and it's going to make you look pretty good in a proposal. And I had other stories in my book where I pointed that out with stories. There's a nonprofit, I think they might be in Baltimore. I know they have multiple locations, but Roca works with at-risk young people, and they're really open about the risks that they have to deal with and how many times it takes to actually reach a young person. And just by being that transparent about the problems, I think gives them a lot of credibility. So I hope I answered the question. I meandered around a little bit, but I like the question.
No, that's wonderful. And what I loved about the anecdote that you shared as well is it helps contextualize maybe how to start having those conversations about experiments and the steps that are involved in thinking through that experiment. So really helpful. Picking up on Justin's earlier comment around, you've got an idea now, and maybe you have some buy-in. How do you take that first next step to actually get the idea accomplished?
Let's see. Yeah. So, execution, right? So we've got a good idea and a plan, and yeah, how do we make sure that, we follow it through? Well, let's see. So in my experience working with it, so I'll just, I'll work with, say, a nonprofit team working on a particular program. And usually, what I like to see is the team come up with some sort of roadmap in writing where the team all agrees, like, here's what we intend to do, and here's the intended impact, here's our program design, just kind of just like maybe a business plan in the business world, but this would be the nonprofit version. And so, within 4 pages or so, just writing, like, making sure the plan is very clear, including the risks and the metrics and the things we're going to watch for. And then you go about doing your work, and executing on it. And I like to see the team then have check-ins at whatever interval makes sense. So depending on the speed of the project and how complex it is, so maybe the team gets back together, every 2 weeks, or, whatever makes sense for the situation. If it's a slow moving project, maybe it's an education project, maybe the right interval is every 3 months, but then the team is getting back together and say, okay, all those things we were going to monitor for, how's it going? Those risks that we were worried about, is it, are we finding ways to overcome those, or is it getting worse? And so to me, that's what creates kind of a living system, to be kind of strategic and innovative and check in and collaborative. So I don't know if that answers Justin's question very well, but that's kind of what I've seen between, like, planning and execution.
Thank you very much. And then the other question, sort of relating to accessing, like, where do you start to identify the unknown unknowns? So you don't know even where to find an app developer. You have this idea, um, but you just don't even really know where to start. You don't actually have that type of network. Um, where do folks go? How do they think about that?
I love that question. So my mind kind of shot off in three directions. So one is, like, if I'm facilitating or working with a nonprofit program team, I might, set them up with a brainstorming exercise where we just, throw things on the whiteboard, like, what are we worried about? What are risks we do know? And then if there are unknowns, maybe we might ask, just what questions should we be asking ourselves? Even if we don't know the answer, just get those questions down. But then I thought of a real life story where I had that situation. I'll be conscious of time, but so when I was in the Peace Corps in Jamaica, and I was working at a teachers college, and I was in kind of a new cultural situation. They did speak English, but a lot of them spoke in a patois, so there's a heavy accent. There's just a lot of, culturally and language wise, I was trying to figure out. And so there I was teaching computer literacy. I taught the students, who were great, and they were coming to my classes. But part of my job was also to teach the faculty, because, you're a Peace Corps volunteer, you're going to leave after 2 years. And the idea is they want you to hand off your skills and for that work to continue. So, half my job was to teach the teachers of the professors at the teachers college. The problem was none of them were coming, and I didn't know why. I had no idea. These were like unknown unknowns, and so, there I was, Leah from Ohio, trying to figure out, what's going on, and I tried all sorts of things. Like, I was totally experimenting in the dark. So I'm getting to your question. So I would try different things. I had no idea what the problem was, or I made fancy, as best as I could, like nicely designed flyers and put them up in the teacher's break room. That didn't seem to work. I personally went around and, like, was nice and had little conversations with the faculty, like, oh, come to my class, it'll be so great. And they just kind of, be polite and look away, and still no one would come. And so, I just kept trying these things kind of blindly in a situation where there were definitely unknown unknowns, and, nothing seemed to be working. And in a way, the solution ended up being a little bit accidental, but because I kept trying, so what it was funny what ended up working. So because I had this, we're in Kingston, Jamaica. somebody had worked really hard to get a nice computer lab that was just sitting empty. And so I thought, well, I'll invite, the ancillary staff. So like the cooks, the janitors, the librarians, it's just sitting here empty and I'm here and, I came all this way. I want to be useful. So I started offering computer literacy classes and it was packed. Like they were highly motivated. Like I remember the next day, I walked up to the lab with my keys and there was a line of people. So what happened through that is I was teaching them and they were so motivated and they were good learners, like word started getting around. And I remember one day I was in line at the cafeteria with the other faculty and the cook like gave me an extra helping of Jamaican jerk chicken and in front of everyone was bragging about, oh, I can now email my niece in the UK and, thank you so much, Miss Krall, this is great. And the faculty standing next to me didn't know how to do those things. So in a way, the success was accidental. But what I took away from that, like in situations where you're just finding your way in the dark, to kind of just do a lot of experimentation, try things maybe blindly, and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. The University of Maryland students listening in are probably familiar with a lot of case studies like that, but was it the invention of the sticky note? It was kind of accidental, right? It was they had this adhesive that nobody knew what to use it for, right? At that was at 3M, I think, and it was somebody who worked there who was also a choir director. Was their little placeholders were always falling out of the choir books and realized, oh, maybe there's a use, and just sticky notes, right? So I think sometimes innovation can be very intentional, like World Reader, they had their two experiments running at the same time. But, there are times where they're just unknown unknowns and you're finding your way in the dark. And I think that's okay too. That's just reality. So I love that question.
And last question, and folks, we do have a couple extra minutes if there are more questions. Last question right now is, failure is personal. It's also organizational. Are there things that you've learned in your experience working with other nonprofits in terms of how to develop that culture of failure, and how to work with your staff or teams or board, to start to think about, like, how are we actually going to experience this failure when it comes, and how do we shift our culture, so that there's both that personal and organizational resilience to stand that kind of
Yeah,
outcome.
that's a really good question. And I feel like I'll attempt to answer it now. And then after this, I'm just going to keep thinking about it because it's a really good question. I want to think more on. Let's see. So that story I shared earlier. So if we're talking about how do we change the organizational culture so that it's less scary to fail? I really like that example from the Hewlett Foundation, right? Where they made it a little bit silly, right? That lowered the pressure, by saying, let's give a silly door prize. What's the worst grant from which you learned the most? Everyone's just kind of outing themselves. I think that's really healthy and good. That things like that can change the culture. Um, let's see, I have more stories in my book along those lines. Um, let's see, I'm trying to think of a good one. Like a lot of times the supervisor, whoever's managing, can lead by example and maybe just be really open. What is it, Bob Ross, right? What was it he would say when he would make a mistake? Another beautiful mistake. He had some saying, right? He would be painting something on live television, happy accident, and just kind of laugh. And if managers can kind of provide that leadership, if you're leading a team meeting about a project and just openly admit, like, well, we learned from that one, didn't we? And just be really open about, past experiments and how you learned and what came of that, right? So much can come from learning, right? And it leads us to discover the next best thing because we failed. So yeah, that's how I think about it. But I love that question. I think it deserves, I'll be thinking more on that.
And if you come up with any ruminations for folks who are interested in the follow-on from that question, maybe we can share it out to the folks who are registered. I think they would appreciate that. This last burning question is, let me understand this. Okay, last burning question is sort of around, like, going back to the where do you get started. I guess I'll summarize it in this way. if you had one recommendation to the audience of what they can do tomorrow to get started to apply some of the lessons and insights that we learned today, what would be that first small step you suggest?
Yeah, one thing I feel really good about is that the practices in my book are things you can do with any size budget, any size team. And so yeah, usually when I get that question, like, what's the one thing I could do? I'd like to direct people like that first section of my book. Those thought exercises are something anyone could do. It doesn't cost money. To me, if we don't make the time to be strategic and think big picture, that will cost money, right? Because we're going to go down bad paths. So to me, the far better thing is make the time to do that sort of strategic thinking. And it's going to save us in the long run. It's going to save time and resources. And so, yeah. And whether you use the types of design thinking exercises I have, like there are plenty of strategic thought exercises. But to me, that's the number one. Just you've got time, right? Everyone has time. It doesn't necessarily have to mean a $30,000 budget. Just set aside some time to do some strategic thinking, and I think so many good things will cascade from that.
I love that. And I think that it gives us who are listening a call to action. Tomorrow we can just schedule 30 minutes if we have it, 25 minutes if we have it, 2 hours if we were that lucky, but not in today's world probably, to just maybe have some open blue sky dreaming with our teams or with ourselves. So I hear a nice little call to action in that. And I think that's a great place for us to leave off. So grateful again to you for sharing your expertise and your insights, and really grateful to you to make the courageous decision to become an entrepreneur yourself and to scale your messaging out so that other people can benefit. So thank you for your time. We will be sharing the recording out, and of course, because I always fudge up the recording at the beginning, we'll have to re-record the the beginning part. But thank you all for those that joined us and those who are watching online. Leah's information, as you saw, is available both if you Google her, and then also kind of midway through this section, so you can go back there. Thank you, Leah, for your time.
Thank you so much. It was such a fun discussion. I really appreciate it.
All right, ciao, ciao.